Okay, so my name is Jackson Justice, and I decided to do my presentation over COVID 19. More specifically, my research question was, how has COVID 19 changed our lives? So when I started this project, I was looking to find massive changes that have come about from COVID 19, like the obvious things that you would imagine would change, such as like the GDP, for example. So there are many obvious changes that have come about from COVID 19. For example, masks. Everybody everybody has to wear masks now for the most part, and I'm sure everyone has gone through the awkward walk of shame when you leave your mask in the car and you have to walk back and go get it. Um, Also, there have been forced lockdowns and quarantines where citizens have had to stay in their houses to avoid being infected and to avoid the spread of the disease. And many businesses have been forced to shut down either for extended periods of time or maybe for a few weeks. But most businesses have been shut down at least for some portion of time during the COVID 19 pandemic. And also, many luxuries such as vacations have been completely canceled due to the pandemic, and that has upset many people. But what are some less obvious things that have changed due to the pandemic? That is the question that I set out to answer when I began this project. I wanted to look at some statistics that I thought would change due to COVID 19. So, the few aspects and the statistics that I chose that I thought would change were suicide rates, crime rates, unemployment rates, and the American GDP, which is gross domestic product, but it basically it's more about the economy. Okay, so the first statistic that I chose out of my less obvious statistics was suicide rates. I had a feeling that the suicide rates would change due to the pandemic, just because, well, there are some obvious reasons. Um, so anyway, I used R to create this plot that's shown on the right, and as you can see, it shows the suicide rates from 1999 to 2018. And I used a data set and I used code in R to make this chart. So as you can see from the chart, there is fairly a fairly steep upward slope that has been happening over the past 20 years. You can see that from 2000 all the way to 2018, um, there's a really obvious change. I mean, it goes from a very low value and then it shoots up to a higher value within the past 20 years. And because 2020 is not over yet, there is no suicide rate that has been 100% recorded yet. But there are researchers that are predicting the suicide rate of 2020 to be 16 to 17%, or there are some who say it could be even higher, such as like the low 20s. So if you look at our chart, you're able to see that 16 and 17% is a fairly high value. It shows that they're fairly high, and you can see this orange line here is the average suicide rate for all 20 years. So you can see that if we're at 16 to 17% or even 20%, we are way above the average suicide rate for the past 20 years. Um, so these rates are very high, and uh, they're much higher than the average. But what you what's strange is that you would not expect such a um, what's surprising is that they are actually in line with my chart. So if you look at my chart, we get all the way up to 14% around 2018, And you can see that 16 and 17%, or even the low 20s, this will be a large jump. It'll make the slope increase quite a bit, but it's actually not unexpected. Like you could expect that. You could expect these numbers given the data that I have over the past 20 years. So that's what I thought was really interesting from this data, because it does really outline that in 2020, if these predictions are correct, the suicide rate is going to jump up quite a bit. And most experts are saying they are basing their predictions off of certain things because people are going to be in quarantine and they're going to be kind of isolated from each other, and that can be very depressing, as I'm sure anybody who's watching this has already found out that being in quarantine can be fairly stressful. And that's kind of why the experts are basing this jump on. So the next statistic that I decided to look at was crime rates, and I figured that maybe because a decrease in the patrols of the police because of COVID-19 and just some other values, I just figured that I would like to check and see if the crime rate really changed much. So I created this chart in R, which represents the overall United States crime rates from the years 1960 to 2019. This plot does a great job of outlining the trends in the crime rate over the past 60 years. Crime rates are fairly low in 1960, and they quickly rose until they hit a climax in the early 80s. Now they dropped off for a little bit, and then they hit another climax in 1995. And for the most part, ever since 1995, there has been a downward trend. You can see in the chart there's a downward trend on the second half of the graph, all the way to 2019. Okay, so anyway, I wanted to test with my graph. I wanted to see where 2020 would be compared to the values given on this chart. So the rates have been dropping at a fairly consistent rate, and since 2020 is not over yet, there hasn't been a concrete crime evidence or a crime rate given for this year. But there are multiple predictions that put the crime rate in the area of 2550. So if these predictions are correct, this would be the first time in nearly 20 years that the crime rate of a certain year would be higher than that of the previous year. Given the next few years, this could mean that the crime rate would be switching to an upward trend instead of the downward trend that has been happening for the past 20 years. Or the other option is that the crime rate would just resume the downward trend in 2021 after this year. But one thing to keep in mind is that COVID-19 cannot be held 100% responsible for this jump in the crime rate because of all of the political unrest of this year. You can't completely base these rates on COVID when there are lots of other things happening at the same time. Alright, so the next value that I decided to look at is the GDP. So first off, I need to let you know that the graph pictured in this slide is actually not one that I created in R. I found it on oag.ca.gov, and I thought that it perfectly illustrates the GDP growth rate of the United States leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see, after the pandemic initially hit, the businesses began to close down. The GDP growth rate dropped dramatically, and you can see that is highlighted by the little yellow section towards the end of the graph. That is the massive drop in the GDP growth rate. that was due to COVID. And then shortly after that, after you see the businesses begin to open again, um, the GDP growth rate almost makes it's a massive recovery. It almost completely makes up all of the for all of the loss that was received at the beginning. So it's crazy to see that the country was able to come back from such a crazy hit that the GDP growth rate took. And I think it will be very interesting to see if it's actually able to come back if there's another set of lockdowns where businesses are shut down due to the resurgence in COVID-19 that's happening right now. I think it'd be very interesting to look and see what happens. It'd be interesting to see if the GDP growth rate can handle another hit like that. So the next statistic that I decided to look at is the unemployment rates, um, and the data set that I found, this particular data set that I used in R, it is from the years 1940 to 2010. So the plot on this page is the yearly unemployment rates of the years from 1940 to 2010. As you can see, the unemployment rate in the United States is very fluid and rapidly changes often. But what we can deduce from the values in this graph is that the average unemployment rate in the United States for all these years, so that rate is 5.51%. So we can say that the average unemployment rate in the United States from the years 1940 to 2010 is 5.51%, and I figured these values using R, and so we can use this and we can compare it to the current unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate in the United States as of November 16th, 2020 is 6.9%, which is just about 1.4% higher than the national average for all the years listed. So this above average unemployment rate is likely due to the economic challenges that have been brought about by COVID-19. The fact that the unemployment rate is only 1.4% higher than the national average over the listed years was very surprising to me because, as I've said before, I was planning to see massive changes in things like unemployment rates because I thought that COVID-19 was having astronomical effects on our society. But as you can see, only being 1.4% higher, it is a fairly large change, but I was expecting changes upwards to 5% higher. But as you can see, that is not true, and this is a good example of why you need to analyze data before you make conclusions. Okay, so those were all of these statistics that I tested for this project, and after analyzing all of the data that I used for this project, I was able to make some conclusions. First, the suicide rates from the given years in my data appear to show that suicide rates this year will be much higher than the average suicide rate from the previous given years in my data. However, it is interesting to look at the data and see that even though they are higher, they are not unexpected when looking at the charts. These numbers are synchronous with the upward trend on the chart. So the next statistic I looked at, my next conclusions were made with the crime rates. So from the chart that I created in R, we were able to see that the crime rate has been on a downward trend for nearly 30 years. So estimates for the crime rate for 2020 appear to show that 2020 may break this downward trend for the first time in 20 years. However, this change in the crime rate may not be 100% attributed to COVID-19 due to all of the political unrest this year. Okay, my next conclusion was that the unemployment rate is only up 1.4% compared to the average from the years in 1940 to 2010. This is surprising because I was expecting this rate to have dramatic changes due to COVID-19, but really 1.4% is not that significant. So lastly, I tested the GDP growth rate in the United States, and we saw that there was a massive drop in the first few months of shutdowns due to the pandemic, only to have a surprising resurgence shortly after businesses began to reopen. So at the beginning of this project, the plan was to outline how massive of an effect COVID-19 has had on all these values. But it was surprising to me to see that although COVID-19 has led to many changes in these values, none of them were astronomical. None of them were huge changes by any means. I mean, the suicide rate was a fairly high jump, but it was nothing unexpected. So this project, I found it to be very interesting, and it demonstrated to me that it is very important not to draw conclusions about a topic before analyzing the data. So yeah, that's it. Um, Here's one more slide, and then lastly, here are my references. These are all the websites that I used on my project. But thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great day.